Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, Africa seeks an action plan on growing calls for compensation for the historical enslavement of millions of its people, as a conference on the push for reparatory justice is held in Ghana. Also, we head out on patrol with some of the MINUSCA peacekeepers in the Central African capital. The UN Security Council's just adopted a resolution to renew the mission for another year as the country remains destabilized by rebel attacks. And African technologies going from strength to strength. So, of course, Eye on Africa heads to Afrotech, which is the best place on the continent to soak up some of the deal-making fervor at the biggest tech salon on the continent. We hear from our tech editor on his findings. But first, a conference calling for an action plan on slavery reparations opened in Accra this week. From the 15th to the 19th century, at least 12.5 million Africans were kidnapped and forcibly transported by European ships and merchants and sold into slavery. Ghana's president, Nana Akufo-Addo, has been a vocal advocate for reparatory justice over the damage done by the slave trade. Our Justice Baidu brings us more from the Ghanaian capital.
It is day 2 of what would be a 4-day conference that is being attended by not less than 5 African heads of state, including the chair of the African Union, Azali Assoumani. Speaker after speaker at this conference have been justifying why the continent deserves this reparations. The president of Ghana, Nana Akufo-Addo, who made a very bold statement at the last UN General Assembly in September, repeated it today, saying that the West had built its wealth and superpower on the back of the exploitation that it had caused on the continent and its people. And the West, the continent, deserved these reparations to have a closure to the issue of the slave trade.
Predictably, the question of reparations becomes a debate only when it comes to Africa and Africans. When the British ended slavery, all the owners of enslaved Africans received reparations to the tune of some £20 million sterling, the equivalent today of some £20 billion sterling. But enslaved Africans themselves did not receive a penny. Likewise, in the United States of America, owners of slaves received $300 for every slave they owed. The slaves themselves received nothing.
This meeting is expected to produce an action plan to ensure the achievement of the payment of these reparations. It is also expected to put together an African-led committee that will push for this to happen. The third thing that this meeting is expected to do is also to connect the people that are attending this meeting and the broader people on the continent to the diaspora to help sustain this advocacy.
Justice Baidu there for us. Now, Downing Street has said that it will still try to prove that Rwanda is a safe place to which to send migrants, despite a ruling from the UK Supreme Court that upheld a Court of Appeal finding that the plans were unlawful. Judges found that the policy could mean that asylum seekers sent to the East African nation could suffer human rights breaches. And South Sudan's fragile peace process moved forward a bit on Wednesday as hundreds of former rebels stood alongside government troops in their first unified deployment. Now, the integration is a key part of a 2018 peace deal that ended a 5-year civil war in which around 400,000 people were thought to have been killed. Well, on Wednesday, the UN Security Council adopted a resolution to renew its peacekeeping mission in the Central African Republic for another year. Now, that will mean the deployment of nearly 18,000 military and police personnel stay in place as part of the MINUSCA operation. The country's still destabilized by ongoing rebel attacks. Our team reports.
We are going to do the security and protection patrol for civilians, as we do every day in the different neighborhoods of Bangui.
Ali is one of 3,000 police officers deployed by the UN to the Central African Republic. Many are from Rwanda, Senegal or Cameroon. Ali is originally from Djibouti and believes the mission has improved security in Bangui. Despite a rise in armed robberies, crime is seldom connected to the ongoing civil war.
Everything is calm. The population goes about its business.
Areas outside of Bangui are more volatile, with sporadic rebel attacks against President Touadera's regime, who is recruiting 900 police officers annually, while the UN peacekeepers provide training and help rebuild the infrastructure.
There are some gaps in terms of resources, and that is what we are trying to provide. For example, there is no police station or gendarmerie brigade in certain areas, which makes it difficult, and so that's where MINUSCA can come and help.
Peacekeepers also help with the response to the arrival of rising numbers of refugees. In the northeast, many have arrived from war-torn Sudan. Here, on the Chadian border, an unprecedented 37,000 asylum seekers need humanitarian aid. The humanitarian coordinator says he only has half the budget he needs to support 2 million people.
Since the crisis in Ukraine, we have felt that the Central African Republic is no longer in the news. And besides, we have made several trips to Europe and the United States to try to remind people that in there is still a humanitarian situation that deserves attention here. So now, with what is happening in the Middle East, unfortunately, we think that the Central African Republic is at great risk of being forgotten.
Many Central Africans welcome the UN's humanitarian missions, but as MINUSCA is limited by its non-offensive mandate, many people here also attribute their peace to Russian allies.
Now, another platform for the celebration and exploration of African filmmaking has emerged. On Wednesday, the first ever Africa Cinema Summit kicked off in Ghana's capital, Accra. The continent's realizing its potential as a film powerhouse, but better accessibility of filmmaking technology has recently led to the emergence of a new generation of filmmakers. The recent huge success of the Nigerian Netflix thriller The Black Book is also a reflection of the international reach of African productions. Well, I'm happy to say with me now is Juliet Ya Asentewa Asante, the CEO of Ghana's National Film Authority and the summit's organizer. Juliet, thanks so much for making the time to squeeze us in on this opening day of the summit. Actually, let's just start with its name. You're calling it the Africa Cinema Summit. We've seen so many festivals on the continent. Is the name specifically a reflection of how you're trying to come at this examination of the industry?
Well, the Africa Cinema Summit, just as the name states, is focused on actual cinema exhibition. And so the marketplace is the biggest or one of the biggest gaps. And so you can have good productions coming out, but without a marketplace, filmmakers are going nowhere. And the entire continent of Africa has less than 1,700 screens. I mean, compared to France, we know that France has over 6,000. China has over 60,000, the US 40, India 11, and yet a continent of over 1.4 billion people have less than 1,700 screens. And so the Cinema Summit really is focused on, one, the growth of content, just like you said, but as well the marketplace and cinema exhibition, to be specific. And so this is not a festival exactly. This is actually a summit. It's the first gathering ever of cinema investors, exhibitors, builders, architects, studios. I mean, all players, stakeholders down the value chain on the African continent. And we are really excited about that.
So it's trying to bring together, trying to boost the overall infrastructure needed within the African film industry, both from the side of viewers to investment. Is that what influences some of the remarks I've heard that you've said recently, which is that you think that despite all the excitement about the continent's filmmaking potential, that it's far from having fulfilled its potential? What's your vision of the scope on that front?
Well, I can tell you for sure that we are barely scratching the surface. I mean, Africa is a continent of over 54 countries with many diverse people, cultures, stories. It's a continent of storytellers, and we haven't told those stories. There's obviously huge gaps. Like the lack of infrastructure. Cinema is one of those. Studios are one of those. Funding is one. Training. There's so many issues at the table. However, without funding, the right funding and the right infrastructure, like I said, we are going nowhere. So we see that there's been some attempts and some successes, and we are grateful for that. But we think that the world is losing out without Africa at the table. And I must say, in just 7 years, Africa will have over 40% of the global youth population. And by 2050, over 70% of the global youth population. And so, you know, trendsetters, consumers of the future are going to be in Africa. And so if you have a continent that is barely watching the world tell its stories, but don't see themselves on screen, that is one, and then do not have the marketplace to be able to grow as well as make stories that can fill those marketplaces and reach its people, I think the world as well is losing out if we are not hearing stories from Africa, because there's so many beautiful stories here.
And how did day one of the summit go? Do you feel that some of the ambitions that you have will move just a little bit closer? Is there anything that you were particularly excited about?
I'm excited about a lot. First of all, the networking, the conversations, the businesses, has been going on. Today, the president of Ghana, Nana, His Excellency, the president was at the summit at the beginning and, for instance, talked about tax incentive as something that the government of Ghana is looking at. The ruler of the Akwemu people was here promising land, setting aside land for the development of a film city. And so many things are happening. Silverbird today made an announcement that from September, they're going to produce African cinema food. So it's been great.
Thank you so much, Juliet, for making the time to speak to Eye on Africa on such an important day. We really appreciate all your insight and the work that you're trying to do to promote cinema on the continent.
Thank you very much.
Well, we are going to stay with African creativity, and tech is no exception as a beneficiary. Investment in African tech firms is predicted to keep growing this year after last year bucking the global trend by rising 8% amidst a global tech downturn. So we're better to soak up the deal-making excitement than the continent's biggest tech salon. That is Afrotech Festival in Cape Town. So we, of course, had to send our technology editor down to Cape Town to give us a sense of what he thought was happening there.
You've got more participants, more exhibitors than last year. Last year was also another year of growth for the African startup economy. And this year is predicted to be growing again up to the tune of about 6.5 billion euros. Now, if you compare this to something like startup investment in Europe, which is expected to be about 50 billion euros this year, you might think it's small change. But it's really the trends that make a stark difference. You look at Asia, Europe, the US, investment, venture capital investment in startups has massively decreased, although US is now predicted to be plateauing, but in Africa it just keeps going up. That's in part thanks to the vibrant startup scenes in countries like Nigeria and Kenya, and also because, well, the rest of the world seems to be relying on artificial intelligence to buoy up its tech sectors, whereas here in South Africa, walking the halls of this exhibition, you can see that it's connectivity which is the main feature. So 4G, 5G, subsea internet cables, satellites, those are the things that are getting the vast African population up and running, connected. And that's also one of the main reasons that the exhibitor Huawei, the Chinese tech company, has such prime position at this festival. They are one of the main sponsors. They have a spot right at the entrance of the exhibit, and it's actually hard to get in there because they're only accepting invitation-based meetings there. So as a journalist, it's hard to get access. And we know why that is, because they've been booted out of the US, they've been booted out from Europe over fears of cyber espionage linked to the Chinese Communist Party. But it's not going to stop them doing good business in Africa.
Peter O'Brien there for us in Cape Town. That is, though, all we have time for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us, though. Do so again if you can. Till then, take care.